I wanted everybody to know that my name is Kim Scheintel. I'm president of the Jewish Genealogical Society. You're all welcome to become members. We have the treasurer here. I'd say hand her the check, but you can't do that through Zoom. But I can give you the information whenever you want. It's $25 for a single, it's $30 for a family, and $50 for a sustaining membership. We like to have you. It helps us to pay for our speakers. And I wanted everybody to know I had an idea because next month we're going to be meeting in person. I thought it would be a good idea for everybody to bring with them one sheet of paper. And on this sheet of paper, I want you to list all of the surnames that you're working on. I've already worked on my one sheet and I put it into a pedigree chart that lists just my direct ancestors. So on my piece of paper, I'm going to have my name listed, my 2 parents, my 4 grandparents, my 8 great-grandparents, et cetera, and on that piece of paper, I was able to put the birth date and place, the marriage date and place, the death date, name and place. And I also encourage on this piece of paper, as you'll see today, it's important to list the year that the people came to the United States for the first time, when they immigrated to the United States. So everybody, your homework, if you're coming in person, is to bring that one piece of paper to share. And if you're in progress, I think it might even be a good idea to make 10 or 20 copies of it if somebody wants your piece of paper. Okay.
Ongoing roots in Israel.
So I think we'll better go ahead and mute everybody, Jim, and then if anybody has a question, I'll unmute myself.
The community today, we invite you to turn on your cameras and to remember that you will be muted during the Zoom. Any questions that you
stand by, I'm going to mute everybody here. Kim, you and
we're grateful today to host educators on our Zoom who are earning professional development credits for their learning.
Okay, so everybody's muted. If you have a question, you'll have to raise your hand and we will call on you. And let's see. I guess it's time for me now to call on Howard Finkel, our program chair, to introduce our speaker and to tell us about some upcoming events. So I turn it over to Howard.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everybody. And actually today is the halfway point of our season. We have 3 more programs to go. On February the 18th, and as Kim mentioned, this will be in person at Kobernik. On February the 18th, Daniel Horowitz, who is an associate of MyHeritage, is going to speak on finding Jewish records in MyHeritage, in the MyHeritage search engine. On March the 17th, 2 of our members, Barbara Field and Roseanne Ullman, are going to do a presentation on how to write my memoirs. That's on March the 17th. And again, that will also be in person at Kobernik. And then our final program of the year, which will be a Zoom program, will be on April the 21st. And it will be William and Malia Levin, who are going to do a program on the Alliance Community Reboot. Alliance Community is an old community in, I believe, in New Jersey, of people who emigrated to the U.S. For the purpose of forming a agriculture collective. It's a very interesting where that has gone and how it still exists and what they're doing. So that will be on April the 21st. Today, let me tell you a little bit about Phil Goldfarb. Phil has researched genealogy for over 35 years, and he is the founding and current president of JGS of Tulsa, which he started in 2005. He has lectured extensively on various topics in genealogy, published articles in numerous periodicals, and authors a monthly column in the Tulsa Jewish Review. He has written 2 books titled A Page of History, Passport Applications, 1851 to 1914, and 1915 to 1925. Phil is a member of the Jewish Gen leadership team, as well as being the lead moderator for the Jewish Gen discussion group. He was chairman of the 2020 IAJGS Awards Committee and sits on the board of directors for several nonprofit organizations. In July 2020, he won an Emmy Award as the co-producer for the Tulsa Historical Society's documentary entitled Lidor Vador, Generation to Generation, A History of Tulsa's Jewish Community, which has been shown on PBS stations around the U.S. In his career, he has personally given over 2,000 presentations, as well as teaching a course on presentation skills. He is the moderator of the Jewish Gen discussion group and also the editor of the Jewish Gen Weekly News Nosh. Phil, you're on. Oh, you need to unmute.
I'll mute myself.
There you go.
Let me share the screen. And let's see here. Let me find my. Okay. Can you see that or no?
No, Phil.
You can't.
Nope.
Okay. Well, let's see here. This is the part that always gets me.
So the green button at the bottom, there you go.
Yeah. Can you see that?
There you go. Now you're up.
All right. So let's start it from the beginning. Okay. How's that? Can you see? Oh boy, it's going too fast. All right. Can you see it? Can everyone see that? Can you see that, Jim, and everyone?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So
except Phil, it looks like the left part of your screen is cut off a little bit for some reason.
so I don't know why.
Okay, just the title page, maybe.
Could be. I don't know why, but we'll see if we can fix it.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it, and I hope you find the meeting to be interesting, educational, and we'll have a little fun. It's a very interesting topic. So let's get started. And I don't know why that left hand is off, but let's see how it works. So we're going to start out with the major areas where the ships left from coming to America directly. They left from Liverpool, London, Southampton, Hamburg, Germany, Bremen, Germany, Le Havre, France, and Genoa, Italy. And we'll talk about Genoa, Italy in just a little bit because it's kind of interesting. Here's a general advertisement on what it looked like to come to the United States, and it was £4 back then for steerage. We'll talk about that. So I want to talk about the history of ship regulations, why we had to have regulations, because in 1817, 2 ships of passengers who were bound for Pennsylvania were diverted and sold for slavery in Delaware. And this created an incredible uproar. And so on March 2nd, 1819, the first law was passed regulating transatlantic passage called the U.S. Passenger Act, excuse me, of 1819. The ship now required a boat manifest. Some of the early ones just had a few names written down, and that's really it. The ship now is limited to departing and arriving where stated in that manifest. And that's important because prior to that, they could just go wherever they wanted to. Oh, well, I don't think I want to go to Philadelphia. Let's just go to Baltimore instead. So fines were levied if not followed. No one wants to be fined. So the timeline of 1830, ships at the time were built to transport cargo and not really passengers. So unused cargo space was subcontracted to the passenger agents, and the passengers were put in steerage for the first time around 1830. Does anyone know where the term steerage comes from? You know, if I do this live, I'd ask the question. Some of you might know, but the term steerage comes from the fact that the control lines or steering line of the rudder ran on this particular level of the ship. So that's where they get the term steerage from. And for the agents, more passengers equaled more money. So they want to get as many people into steerage as possible. Here's an example of there's second class. Here's steerage down here and storage here. And so they're all over the ship. But steerage is down here. So again, prior to 1830, there was no food was provided for the passengers. They waited in the port until the boat's cargo was full. Then they were loaded on. So they're essentially second, third class people. Ship didn't leave until the steerage was full, and passengers brought food for 4 to 8 weeks. But in a lot of cases, they had to wait up to 2 weeks until the steerage was full. So they may have eaten all their food. Sailing ships at the time, again, these were sailboats, took about 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. With adverse winds or bad weather, it could take as long as 14 weeks. Again, being on that ship for 14 weeks, think about that, with no food provided. So steerage had poor lighting, little ventilation, no sanitary facilities, no clean water, little space. And the result, of course, increased mortality, sickness, incapacitation. But those who survived the trip on the ship needed assistance when they arrived, particularly the older ones. Very tough traveling. Most plans don't show. This is an example of the central space of a steerage. Here's where they slept and they ate in the center. I have another picture of this. So by the 1840s now, more laws were passed to protect passengers. Regulations now require 2 bathrooms for every 250 people. 2 bathrooms for every 250 people. Think about that. I have a daughter who wanted one by herself. Bathrooms were on the main deck, not in steerage. So the steerage passengers had to go up to the main deck to go to the bathroom. A lot of times the bathrooms leaked, it flooded and dropped on steerage passengers. Not a fun place to be. So legislation made it the responsibility of the shipping company to now provide food and water on the journey. This was the 1840s. 1848, American Passenger Act passed to improve traveling conditions by regulating ventilation and prescribed a minimum of space for each passenger. And here's a picture of some of the steerage passengers up on the main deck trying to get some air. So now we're in the Passenger Act of 1855. And obviously the United States wanted immigrants to come to America and help settle the West. So ship captains paid money for those who died on the ship, so they didn't want that. They wanted the passengers to make it all the way. By this time, shipping companies began using steamships to transport immigrants to America. Some ships carried livestock, and the ships will then advertise if they did not carry livestock due to the smell. Come to my ship, the Holland America line. We don't have livestock. Smells great, except when it rains down into steerage. The steerage was 8 to 10 feet tall. A berth was 6 feet wide, and usually it was 2-tiered. And here's an example of a ticket for Nicholas Fish going from London to New York. All right, now we're in the 1870s. By the 1870s, the journey across the Atlantic took about 2 weeks, and ships started to provide food. Now, religious Jews would not eat the ship food and brought their own. So again, they had to have it for at least 2 weeks. They may not have boarded the ship immediately either, so you have to prepare for that. Passengers will bring their own bedding. Obviously, it's the bedding there. It was not very comfortable. Ships separated single men from single women, port and aft. Married passengers and children in the same family travel together. And here's another picture of people eating. You can see the berths in the back, but big pots of food, and that's how they ate. They didn't have room service, by the way. So who was responsible for the passengers? It was the federal responsibility for the ocean part of the ship. So the United States was responsible for the ocean part of the ship, state jurisdiction over immigrants when they landed. So if they landed in Castle Garden, it was New York. If they landed in Baltimore, it was Maryland. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, it was Pennsylvania. In 1882, all the immigration was turned over to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Money, it's back to money. Okay. Now we're going to where probably most of our relatives came from in between 1900 and 1920. 90% of the immigrants arriving at Ellis Island were joining family or friends. between 40% and 65% of immigrants arriving came either on prepaid tickets or with money sent to them from the United States. Principal shipping lines had hundreds of agents in the United States selling tickets for their relatives. Freelance ticket agents travel through parts of Europe, moving from village to village, shtetl to shtetl, selling tickets. Here's your first trivia question. Which is smaller, a shtetl or a village? The answer is a village. A village had less than 500 inhabitants. A shtetl had more than 500 inhabitants. So at times you'll see in Jewish Gen so-and-so village smaller than a shtetl. So after 1900, in addition to a ticket, immigrants had to secure a passport from officials in their own country. Remember this, they had to secure a passport. So immigrant Jews from Europe, the surge was between 1881 and 1924. Over 2.5 million Jews immigrated to the United States during this time. Many Orthodox Jews ate only herring, black bread, and tea they had brought with them because they feared that the ship's food was not kosher. And to go back, the surge was because most of the immigrants came from the Pale of Settlement. And 1881 is, if you know your history, is when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, and his son, and he was the good Tsar. He was the one who really let Jews almost do what they wanted, let them have education, let them move around. But when he was assassinated, his son Alexander III instituted one country, one religion, the one rule. So pogroms ensued. It was the May laws, and that's why most of the Jews left the Pale of Settlement at this time. Often, the husband or eldest son went to America first, got a job. They earned enough money for the rest of the family to join them. Some of the steamship companies that transported our ancestors, the White Star Line was most noted for. Second trivia question was the Titanic. If you got Titanic, that's the answer. The Red Star Line, a Hamburg America Line, a Cunard Line, North German Lloyd Line. I picked an arbitrary year, 1903, in the top 10 ports of arrival in North America. You can see Ellis Island had 706,000 immigrants in 1903, that one year. And it was 10 times the second one, which is Baltimore, then Boston, Montreal, Philly, Honolulu, San Francisco, Key West, New Orleans, and even New Bedford had about 4,000 over a year's time. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm really going to try to concentrate on Ellis Island. So I want to talk about the biggest fallacy in genealogy. What's the biggest fallacy in genealogy? And hopefully you all know that names were changed at the port. The inspectors had no reason, there was no requirement, no legal authority. They didn't have the time or impetus to change immigrants' names. They really had enough to do. Manifests changed throughout the years as more information and questions were asked, but names were not changed. The ticket included many times a railroad ticket to their final destination, and manifests, of course, were filled out ahead of time, the name, age, and again, if you look at manifests, they changed over the years. They got better as it went along. So for much of Ellis Island's early time as an immigration station, there was really no law that required immigrants to prove their identity or to use the name shown on a manifest in the United States. However, an immigrant could change their name before they boarded the ship, but the name on the manifest when embarking onto the trip had to match the name upon disembarking. It had to match. Immigrants could use any name they wanted after they passed through the immigration procedures and process and left Ellis Island. There was no legal reason that they continued to use their names as shown on any of the documents unless they wanted to prove they had been vaccinated. Changing one's name was apparently a personal decision. And many times names were changed to, as all of you know, to Americanize them for work or school, but it was not done at Ellis Island or any of the ports. I used to say that not a single name was changed at Ellis Island, and I was wrong, because there was one name that was changed at Ellis Island, one documented case. In 1908, a manifest page showed a name changed by immigration authorities. A woman traveling under a man's name, she called herself Frank Woodall, and in male attire for employment reasons was detained and went through a special inquiry. She was found to be a desirable immigrant and was allowed into the country because there was no law that prohibited what she was doing, nor her use of a male name. However, her male alias was changed on the manifest to her legal name, Mary Johnson, by the Ellis Island authorities. And how do you think she was caught? Medical exam. Pretty obvious. And we'll talk about the medical exam in just a few minutes. Once released, she could use any name she wanted, including a male alias. And apparently she did. She disappeared to become anonymous. But that was the one single change, documented change. And here it is, the actual special inquiry page. Mary Johnson traveling in male attire as Frank Woodall. And here's the manifest. Pretty cool. Here's an example of a sample of a ship manifest. This is from 1907 from the Italia. And Castle Garden and the Battery, of course, those of you know, before Ellis Island, it was Castle Garden and Battery, 1855 to 1891. 8 million immigrants entered. And then Ellis Island started January 1, 1892 to 1954. About 12 million entered, with about 20% being Jewish. So now we're going to talk about traveling around 1900. The voyage now took only 7 to 17 days. Bathrooms were still not clean until the end of the trip. And hopefully they didn't drip onto the steerage. Many nationalities were put together now. They kept Jews in a separate area, Italians in a separate area, Irish in a separate area. So they got to talk to each other. You had some communication, some interaction. By 1903, a steerage class steamship ticket was between $25, which is $874 in 2024 dollars, and $35, $1,220. Think about that. That's still a lot of money. Second class was about $20 more, or $700 more. Many immigrants worked for years to get the money, especially if they had a family. Now we're again in the 1900s. Each steerage passenger was assigned a numbered berth, along with a canvas or burlap mattress stuffed with hay or seaweed. That's why some passengers brought their own. A life preserver, which doubled as a pillow. They had a tin pail and utensils for meals, often served from a huge tank. You saw that in the earlier photo with the huge tanks of food. Bunks were stacked 2 side by side, and a compartment might accommodate anywhere from 100 to 400 more passengers. The profitability on a single ship was enormously profitable for the steerage, for the lines. The average cost of a ticket, as I mentioned, was only $30, but larger ships could hold 1,500 to 2,000 immigrants in steerage, netting a profit of between $45,000, which is over $1.5 million in 2024 dollars, and $60,000, which was over $2 million for a single one-way voyage. That's just for steerage class. That doesn't include first or second. So enormously profitable. And they just back and forth, back and forth. The cost to feed a single immigrant was about 60 cents a day in 1902, which is about $21 in 2024 dollars. Okay, on board the ship. Think about this. Most could not read, write, or speak English. They had anywhere from $5 to $25. They sang songs. What they do on the ship, they sang songs. They played cards. They told stories. On board, rumors were rampant about life in America, combined with stories about rejections and deportations at their destination. It circulated endlessly. You know, it's like fake news, I guess you could call it. There were rehearsals for answering the immigrant inspectors' questions. Some of them thought they knew the questions, but most of them didn't. Hour upon hour was trying to learn the new language. So again, picture yourself. And what I'd like you to do for the rest of this is kind of picture yourself and think about your relatives who made that journey. Not the ones that stayed in the old country, but the relatives who made that journey, probably not being able to see their homeland or relatives again. They didn't speak the language. They couldn't write the language. They couldn't read the language. Yet they made that decision to come over so that their future family, you, would have something good. And it was because of politics, pogroms, poverty. We like to call it the 3 Ps, is why people left the old country. Okay, so they're sighting America now. By the time the ship approached this long-awaited end, most immigrants were really in a state of shock, physically, mentally, emotionally. Many Jews were hungry because they might have run out of food if they were kosher, as many shared it with their fellow Jewish passengers. Most looked at the shores of their new country with tears of relief streaming down their faces. Again, put yourself on that ship. There you are. You're on that ship, okay? And you're looking out. You're looking out to see Ellis Island. You're arriving into Ellis Island, and you don't know what to expect. You really don't. So now we're going to talk about processing immigrants into Ellis Island. This is what your relatives had to go through when they were processed. So medical inspectors would board incoming ships in the quarantine area at the entrance to the lower bay of New York Harbor. They were examined from 7 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. After the medical inspectors left, the ship would move north through the Narrows, leading to Upper New York Bay and into the harbor. Now, if you had enough money and you were in first and second class passengers, they were quickly and courteously inspected on board the ship before being transferred to New York. They didn't have to go through what the steerage passengers did. They were not required to undergo the inspection process. Only steerage passengers did at Ellis Island. The theory was if they can afford a first or second class ticket, they were less likely to become a public charge in America due to medical or legal reasons. So again, first and second class, bang, right through. Steerage is what we're going to talk about now. They were sent to Ellis Island for further inspection if they were sick or had legal problems. So now, processing immigrants into Ellis Island. The ship was now docked at the harbor. After inspection, as I mentioned, the first and second class passengers would disembark, pass through customs at the pier, and enter the United States. Steerage or third class passengers were transported from the pier by a ferry or barge to Ellis Island, where everyone was to undergo a medical and legal inspection. Each wore a name tag with their manifest number. They were assembled in groups of 30 according to the manifest number, and their baggage was piled in the lower decks until they passed all this. So the landing tags, they were divided in groups at the station, all members usually from the same manifest page, and that's why that manifest page is so important if you can find your relatives. They were given a landing tag with instructions on the back in several languages, so they had to have this landing tag with them. The instructions said, keep this card to avoid detention at quarantine and on railroads in the United States. Also, when landing at New York, this card to be attached to the coat or dress of the passenger in a prominent position. I want to show you one. The tag showed their ship name, their manifest page, and line number, usually in large type, as well as their name. And so this is because the immigration and investigators at Ellis Island didn't have to ask the immigrant for his or her name. They could just read it off that immigration tag and landing tag and match the person to the specific line with that person's name on the manifest, because they had to move fast. These inspectors did it very quickly. Asking an immigrant for their name May also have been a way to detect hearing and speech problems, though. So here's what a landing tag looked like. You notice the manifest sheet number, the line, the list number, what list number on that particular manifest sheet, their name of passenger, address of destination, and here's the back of it. When landing at New York, this card to be attached. So they're at Ellis Island. They're going to meet their first American, their interpreter. The average number of languages spoken by an interpreter was 6, but 12 was not uncommon. The record was 15 languages that each interpreter needed. They were led up to a large stairway, and they may not have realized it, but this was now taking their first test. A doctor stood at the top of the stairs watching for signs of lameness, heavy breathing, which could indicate a heart condition, or bewildered glazes, symptomatic of a medical condition. And by the way, back where I said that the average number of languages spoken by an interpreter, if someone says, "Oh, we changed the name on the ship because that's what the inspector said," no, they knew the language, they could read the language, and that's what they did. So, I don't know who was the most famous interpreter at Ellis Island? This is another trivia question, which is a lot of fun. And if you're from New York, you should know this. There he is. Who is that? Fiorello LaGuardia, the most famous interpreter at Ellis Island. 1882 to 1947, his mother, Irene Cohen LaGuardia, came from a very famous Italian Sephardic Jewish family.
Wow.
He worked as a translator for the U.S. Immigration Service from 1907 to 1910. At night, he then attended the New York University Law School, and he could speak English, Hebrew, Croatian, German, Italian, Hungarian, and Yiddish. So he was an excellent interpreter. Who knows? Maybe one of your relatives, if they came in during that time, had the Fiorello LaGuardia as their interpreter. He became mayor of New York from 1934 to 1945. So now they're getting ready to pass the medical exam. As each immigrant passed, a doctor with an interpreter at his side would examine the face, hair, neck, and hands. The doctor held a piece of chalk and would write a letter on the immigrant's clothing, indicated if they were to be detained for further inspection. For example, if they had a heart condition, it was an H. If they had a hernia, I believe it was a K. And I'll show you this in just a few minutes. Now, interesting about the Italians coming from Genoa. I talked earlier about some at a certain period of time they needed some paperwork to come through, but for whatever reason, those from Genoa, from Italy, did not have the proper paperwork when they came through Ellis Island. So let me go back to they didn't have the proper paperwork. So what would the interpreter write on his back? Without papers, WOP, without papers. And most of them were from Italy. 99% of them were Italian. So the term, here comes a WOP, without papers. The term was never meant to be derogatory in any way, shape, or form, but it did become derogatory. About 2 out of every 11 were detained for further examination. So here's the inspection symbols. If someone had crabs, they had a C. If someone had a heart condition, they had an H. Hernia was a K. And this is probably how that female got outed, if you want to say that. A vaginal infection, PG for pregnancy. And again, without papers, a WOP. If they suspected a mental deficit or defect, they put an H, an X, I mean. An X circled was definite. So this is very interesting. Now, here's another thing that happened at Ellis Island. Much like WOP, the origin of the ethnic slur of kike, the word kike. Although uncertain, the most likely origin of the word kike was born on Ellis Island around 1900 or so. Jewish immigrants who were illiterate, and many of them were, could not sign using the Latin alphabet letters, were asked to sign the entry forms with a customary X. Well, Many Jewish immigrants would refuse because they associated the X with the cross of Christianity. And by doing so, it would be repugnant to them. So they refused to write the X. What happened? The custom officials became aware of this and learned to ask some Jewish immigrants to make a circle as the signature on the entry form instead of an X. Well, the Yiddish word for circle is keikel, or for little circle, keikeks. So they were called making a keikel. So before long, the immigration inspectors were calling anyone who signed with an O instead of an X, a keikel, or keikles, or keiki, or finally and succinctly, a keik. Here comes a keik. So again, never meant to be an ethnic slur. It came from wanting to write an O instead of the cross. Now, we're getting ready to pass the medical exam. Whole groups would be made to bathe with disinfectant solutions. The line would move on from there. Then you had the dreaded eye man, who was next. And they were looking for trachoma, which is the eye disease, which causes blindness and even death. And more than half of the medical detentions were due to this. And this meant certain deportation back to their home. If they had any of the diseases, were too ill or feeble-minded to earn a living, they would be deported. And again, who would pay for that? The ship line. Ship line did not want to take that. Children 12 or younger who were sent back to Europe alone, or older were sent back to Europe alone, I'm sorry. Children younger than 12 had to be accompanied by a parent. And here's the dreaded eye man looking someone in the eye. That's a great picture, by the way. And here's the inspection card that they had to have. And probably those who were WAPs did not have it. The disinfection card, once they passed through disinfection, they gave them a disinfection card. And the final test. After the medical exam, the final test was from the primary line inspector, who was seated on a high stool with the ship manifest and an interpreter at his side. The ship's manifest log that had been filled out at the port of embarkation contained the immigrant's name and specific information. They also had a list of 31 questions that the immigrant had to answer. And this document was used by legal inspectors to cross-examine the immigrants during the legal inspection. I mean, that was still happening and still happens now. I came in from Canada. Oh, I guess it was during the Iraqi war, one of the wars. And I gave him my passport and he said, who won the Civil War? And I said, well, it was the North won the Civil War. He said, okay, go through. I said, what happens if I would have said the South? He said, you don't want to know. All right, so if papers were in order and good health, the entire inspection process would take 3 to 5 hours. So some of the trick questions, immigration officials would turn away. They would turn away communists, anarchists, and bigamists. They asked questions, are you a communist? Are you an anarchist? Are you a bigamist? If the person answered yes to any of these questions, they were gone. They were rejected. If the person answered no to any of the questions, they were put aside for further questioning. Why? Because the correct answer was, what is a communist? What is an anarchist? What is a bigamist? So the rationale being, 125 years ago, most people would not be familiar with these terms. If they were aware, then they might have been one. They were now questioned in greater detail. And here's the inspector sitting with the interpreter, and here's the immigrant coming through that, coming through that line. So the inspectors processed an average of 5,000 people a day. Only 2% of arriving immigrants were excluded from entry, but 2% of 13 million is 260,000. So a lot of them were denied entry. Reasons why? If the doctor felt that they had a contagious disease that would endanger the public, if the legal inspector felt that the immigrant was likely to become a public charge or an illegal contract laborer, those are two of the reasons. And here's just a medical evaluation, affected ability to earn. He had a hernia, which affected his ability to earn a living. This person was never allowed to enter. They went to the detention pen at Ellis Island, and that's where they stayed until they went back, or until they got cleared for whatever reason. So beyond Ellis Island, what happened after the Ellis Island? Your relatives got cleared. They had their landing cards pinned to their clothes. They moved to the money exchange. 6 cashiers exchanged gold, silver, paper European money for American dollars. Daily rates were posted. For immigrants traveling to cities and towns beyond New York City, the next stop was the railroad tickets office, and a tickets agent sold as many as 25 tickets per minute on busy days. And they would be ferried to barges to train terminals in Jersey City or Hoboken, where they would take trains. What's interesting is hopefully you found your ship manifest of your relative, because there's a lot of information out there. I know I found one of my great-grandfather. He was a pharmacist. Actually, I'm a 4th generation pharmacist, but he was a pharmacist coming over. He had $795, which he declared on him. And then I later found out that my great-grandmother had diamonds sewed into her bodice of her dress. So there's a lot of things you can find on that ship manifest. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Dillingham Immigration Commission of 1909. It was a research and report on steerage conditions only. And the report was very racist. Immigrants, quote, are of poor quality, competes with natives, and contributes to the buildup of poverty in the country. Well, of course, the interesting part is, unless you were a Native American, everyone was an immigrant. Everyone on this commission was an immigrant. And this led to the Immigration Act of 1917, which required a literacy test for immigrants, and the 1920 Emergency Quota Act, which restricted immigrants to 3% of the 1910 census population, or about 2,766,000 immigrants were allowed to enter the U.S. And again, it was all predicated on the country. 1924 amended version restricted immigrants to 2% of the 1890 population, or 1,259,595. And this is, again, these acts, the 1924 acts, was the reason why many Jews were not allowed to come from Germany or Russia or whatever after this time. You've heard of the SS St. Louis. This is what they used to keep those people out, the 1924 Quota Act. Okay, and here's an example of a nasty poster. The Chinese must go. Working Party's men of California. Here's the ocean, California. The Workers' Party kicked the Chinese out. So the goal of the immigrants, which was dedicated on October 28th, 1886, was the Statue of Liberty. Come to the United States, the Statue of Liberty. That was the goal. And again, picture yourself on that deck. You're seeing the Statue of Liberty. How are you feeling? How are you feeling? You're that relative. You should always remember that relative. Emma Lazarus, of course, was the American Jewish poet who was born in New York City from a Sephardic family, originally from Portugal. Her family had lived in New York since the colonial times. She helped establish the Hebrew Technical College. She wrote the sonnet, the New Colossus, in 1883. And that's why I'm bringing this up. That's why I'm bringing her up. In 1903, it was engraved on a bronze plaque and mounted inside the Statue of Liberty. She is buried in Beth Olam Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. And this is what she looked like, Emma Lazarus. And so I want to conclude today's presentation by just reading this most beautiful sonnet. Not unlike the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is imprisoned, lightning in her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I will lift my lamp beside the golden doors. And this is what your relatives came to America for. If you have any questions, you can email me. This is my email address, phil.goldfarb@cox.net. And I'm going to open it up for questions. So with that, I will stop sharing.
They get there.
Thank you. So I will
Yeah.
open up for any questions that you'd like. I'll stay as long as you have questions.
You're terrific.
Thank you.
Well, my question, what got you interested in all of this?
What got me interested in genealogy is actually a wonderful story. I was getting ready to be bar mitzvah, and my grandfather set me down, and he said, "Here's our story." His father, my great grandfather, was a pharmacist in Russia, and he had a pharmacy and a liquor store because he used liquor to make the drugs back then.
Yeah.
And so he became friends with a Russian general, and the Russian generals really ran Russia because Tsar Nicholas was very ineffective. And so the Russian general would come in every day for a free schnapps, and my great grandfather would give him a free schnapps. And so one day, the Russian general, whose name I do not know, my grandfather did not know because he was young at the time, and said, Gitovich, you need to sell your drugstore and your liquor store because there's going to be a pogrom here. They knew ahead of time there's going to be a pogrom. This was in Exlanoslav, which is now Dnepro, Ukraine. And so my grandfather, my great grandfather, sold his drugstore, took his wife and 3 children. One was my great grandfather. My grandfather went on a ship. This was 1904, and a month later, January 1905, they had the largest pogrom in Exlanoslav at that time. And what's also the rest of the story, like Harvey used to say, the rest of the story was, if you've ever been to Ellis Island, there's a little section there that talks about pogroms. And it talks about that particular pogrom, January 4th or 5th, 1905 in Exlanoslav. And if my great-grandfather hadn't been friends with this Russian general, I would not be here talking to you. And that's what got me interested in genealogy.
Wow. Thank you.
So I have a question. This is Howard. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
If you were sent back, who paid for that?
The shipping line.
Okay, and were you sent back to the place that you had started from, or
Yes. Well, it was sent back to the port. So if you left from Hamburg, you were sent back to Hamburg.
Okay, and then you were from there. It was your responsibility to go wherever you
Exactly.
had to go.
Yeah.
Phil, hi. My name is Mark Weinberg.
Hi, Mark.
I want to thank you very much for a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
It actually brought tears to my eyes thinking of what my grandparents had to go through to get here.
Yes.
I do have a specific question about documentation. You mentioned that the immigrants had to have passports after a certain date. You didn't say anything about visas, and I would also like to know what was involved in someone who lived in a tiny shtetl in the far reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. How did they manage to get a passport? Was it a complicated, difficult process?
Well, it depends upon the year as well. The year changed. Some didn't need passports. Some did. Depends upon when they came over. But they could get passports. They'd have to pay for the passports. And of course, there were some Russian internal passports that you had to have as well to go from place to place. I don't know if any of you've seen Russian internal passports. I submitted a presentation on passports, Russian, Lithuanian internal passports, the Nansen refugee passports. There are a lot of different passports that you could get. So it depends upon the year when and what type of passport you could get. Something simple was, this person was from so and so and so and so. A lot of times it wasn't formalized, but again, the ones from Genoa who came from Genoa were without papers, and they were the WOPs. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's in general. You can never be too specific. Yes, Doug, you're muted.
Emily Garber gives a terrific presentation on what the papers that our ancestors needed to get out of Russia, particularly. And I know she's on the speaker circuit. She also presented it in London last summer. Maybe she'll give it again in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
The problem, my grandmother did get a passport. Grandfather came over 4 years later. My grandmother came over. She got a passport. She went out of
Hamburg?
No, begins with an L. It's Russian. The Russian port, which came later on the Russian American lines after 1910. She got her passport at the port of debarkation. But many people left by crossing the borders illegally, particularly going from the Pale into Germany, and they didn't have passports.
Yeah.
Lipaja is the
Okay.
the Lithuanian name.
Lithuania, yeah. I know from the great grandparents that I told you about. They took a train from Xlanoslav, changed and went to Hamburg and left from Hamburg. So it just depends. There's a question, Mike. Do you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, great talk. You just mentioned trains, so I'm trying to figure out how my father got from Zhytomyr to Rotterdam. How can we ever figure that out?
That's a good question. Don't know. Don't. Some walked miles through the country. Some were hitched on a horse. Some were in a wagon. And it may have taken weeks, months, a year to get to the port. Depends how much money they had. If they only had enough money for the ship ticket, then they had to improvise and find ways to get there. It was tough. I mean, it wasn't easy.
Yeah. All
So
right.
again, what I'd like you to get out of this presentation is if you don't remember anyone, if you don't find anyone, find the family member who made that decision, who came over, who risked their lives, who came to the United States to make a better future for you and for their relatives. That's who I honor.
Yes.
Questions? Janella, is that it?
Hi.
Hi.
My grandfather came over from Udenheim, Germany. Do you know anything about Udenheim? And
I
I
do
think he was a doctor, and he went to Philadelphia. So
Okay.
I don't think he got his medical degree in America. He apparently had it in Udenheim. I don't even know. I don't know what Udenheim is today, but
Well, you can look on Jewish Gen and put it in for Jewish Gen towns and find out what it is
Okay.
today.
okay.
You haven't done that. Yeah.
No,
Did-
I
did you-
haven't done
did you
anything.
Did you find his ship manifest?
Oh, nothing. I've done nothing. This is
Yeah.
just the beginning.
I mean, if you find the ship manifest, it should say occupation doctor.
Yeah.
What was that location you said to go look for that information?
Look for the town name.
No, you just before when you were giving your response, you
Jewish
said
Gen. Jewish Gen.
Jewish Gen. Okay.
Oh yeah. If you haven't been on Jewish Gen, if you haven't checked out jewishgen.org, you're missing you're missing a complete plethora of information about overseas. I mean, I found this particular great grandfather. I found their marriage license of my great grandparents.
Wow.
I found that he was a corporal in the Russian army from that marriage license. I found where he lived. I mean, there's so much information that Jewish Gen does, and that, to be honest, that's why I do the moderating and why I do the News Notch. It's my way of giving back for all the
Yeah.
records that I found.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Phil, do you know if women were able to make the journey unaccompanied by men?
Yes,
Sure.
they could. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. They could.
I'm surprised it was considered okay by the traditional folks.
Well, they kept all the women together, and you have to remember, a lot of times the husband went over first
Mhm.
to get a job, to make enough money to send for the wife or the rest of their family.
Uh-huh.
So it's not uncommon. Or they sent their firstborn son to do that.
Phil, I have a question. I've
Yes,
got
ma'am.
all the ship manifests for all my relatives that came to this country, and I never really noticed. How do I know if they came steerage first or second class by looking at the ship manifest?
It should say in the upper corner.
Now, do they put them all on the same sheet of paper?
Well, no, there's numerous. If there's 400, let's say there's 400 people in steerage, they'll have, I think, like 50 on each page or something like that.
But they put all the steerage people on the same sheet of paper?
Not the same sheet of paper.
But I mean, on the same list, or do they have separate
Yeah,
lists?
yeah. I would go to. Have you been to stevemorse.org? Okay, for those of you who haven't, and you're trying to find your ship manifest, stevemorse.org has ship manifests going back to, from Baltimore, from Galveston, from Ellis Island, from Castle Garden. It's a great place to go to, and you can broaden your search because, and I'll tell you something interesting about finding your ship manifest. I mentioned that my great grandparents and their 3 sons came over. Whoever transcribed their names, it was transcribed 3 different ways. So if I remember right, my great grandfather was transcribed as Gatovich, spelled one way. My great grandmother and one of the sons was transcribed as Gatovich, spelled a different way, and the last 2 sons, were transcribed as Gatovich from the ship manifest 3 different ways. So you have to really search and look. Other questions?
Oh yeah, I have a question about the literacy test.
Yeah.
You mentioned that 1917, the United States imposed the literacy tests.
Yes.
Does that suggest that they wouldn't let them into the country if they didn't know enough English?
No, they could ask the questions in their language, because remember, they had interpreters.
But
I mean,
literacy is reading and writing.
Yeah. But can you read and write in your language?
Oh, so they could demonstrate knowledge of any language.
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Marlene, I think you had a question. Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
my question, why I don't look into all of this, is my father's name was Mofshet, that was changed to Markowitz.
Okay.
So do I start looking up Mofshet?
Of course.
Well, do you have his naturalization record?
I think we do, yeah.
Okay. Naturalization record and petition for naturalization record should tell you the ship name, the ship when they came in, and then you go back and look on that ship manifest and see if what name it was on that ship manifest. If it was the more American name, it was done before he left the old country. If not, it was the old name, then they changed it in the United States. Now, when you have that old name, that's when you go to Jewish Gen, and you
Right.
can look up the name that way.
Right.
Yep.
That's what I'm going to do. Thank you.
It's fun. Genealogy is fun. It's tedious, but it's fun.
Yes.
Deanna.
Yes, thank you for this excellent, very well detailed presentation.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. And I have a question, whether Galicia, during the time that it was Austria-Hungary, and now it's the Ukraine, was that considered Pale of Settlement?
Yes, it was.
It was.
Yeah.
And would it be right to say that my grandparents left because of poverty there and pogroms? I wasn't
Well,
sure about
Yeah,
pogroms.
yeah, like I said, it was the 3 Ps why people left: poverty, pogroms, and politics. Those are the 3 reasons. And the Pale of Settlement, of course, was from 1791 to 1917, and it was horrible conditions for the people in the Pale. And the only time it ever got good was when, as I mentioned, Tsar Alexander II was the Tsar. But here's another little trivia question for you. Well, first of all, prior to the Pale of Settlement, there weren't that many Jews in Russia. Most of them lived in Poland. About 80% of the Jews lived in Poland. When Russia started getting pieces of Poland, 1891, 1893, 1895 is when the Jews came to Russia. And that's when the Tsar started doing some bad things to them. But the irony of this whole thing is, I'll stop soon. The irony of this whole thing is that, as I mentioned, Alexander II was a great Tsar. He called a reformer Tsar. If you've ever been to Finland, there's a big statue of him. If you've ever been to St. Petersburg, there's the Church of the Spilled Blood, where he was assassinated. They built a big, beautiful church over it. You can see his blood. But the irony is, his first son was Nicholas, not the one who became Tsar, Nicholas. But he died. At the age of 21 of sepsis, and he was just like his father. He was groomed to be a reformer, and he would have followed the same path, and the Jews would have probably had a good life. But unfortunately, when he died, and his brother, who was essentially a moron, if you really want to be honest, became the Tsar, and he contradicted all his father's reforms, and that's when it started getting bad. That's when the Jews left the Pale of Settlement.
Wasn't hemophilia part of that family?
Well, that came from Queen Victoria, the hemophilia, which went down to Tsar Nicholas, Tsar Nicholas II, and his son, who was a real hemophiliac, who were all assassinated in 1917. Don't you just love history? That's why genealogy is so fun. It really is interesting. Any other questions? And Anita, if you unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Oops.
Okay, there you go.
Were there any countries or any specific countries or any specific areas within specific countries where immigrants would not be permitted entry into the U.S.? Like I saw one of your things later where it said, keep the Chinese out. Were there other countries, did that really happen? That they would keep people out just because they were Chinese? Or were there countries or other areas where
they tried to keep them out, because remember, during that time, the 20s, 30s, started having the Depression, and people didn't want immigrants coming and taking their jobs.
Right.
So there was a lot of problems with letting people in. So the answer is yes. But you remember what happened with after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were interred in California.
Mm-hmm.
That was just because of what the Japanese bombed, but yeah.
Were there any other countries where the immigrants would be categorically denied? No, you come from this country, you can't come in. That's the only one?
No, not really. No,
Oh.
no. America, give me you're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses turn to be free. We were always a very open country. And again, if you weren't a Native American, you were an immigrant. We all were immigrants. You weren't a Native American. We have a lot of Native Americans here in Oklahoma, but everyone else was an immigrant. Mark.
It was a wonderful talk, and thank you very much. I'd like to ask first about, I know about the Ellis Island website, although it was 10 times larger than most of the other ports in terms of number of immigrants. What about the other immigrant locations? Are there any analogous websites, special exhibits, databases that we should know, or all we get that through the usual Jewish genealogy?
Yeah, not as good as the Ellis Island one, but again, SteveMorse.org is really good.
Right.
I mean, that's really good. He's outstanding.
And I'd like to ask a question, less about the genealogy, but you've been doing this for so many years. Do you have any favorite books or movies that are accessible for the general reader?
Books on what?
Books or movies that are accessible for the general reader that you admire and would suggest we take a look at?
Oh gosh. Not offhand, no. I would say Google what you want.
Yeah.
I would say
mean,
you could look at the movie that I won an Emmy Award for. It's called Lador Vador, Generation.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, and of course we all know the story, the Exodus. We know the story of the Jewish immigrants that were turned back and sent back.
Right. But the Exodus. Yeah, exactly.
Phil, believe it or not, one of my favorite books is the one that's called Getting Started in Jewish Genealogy, and it's only about 60 pages, and they update it every few years. Do you know that one?
Yeah, I do.
It's very basic.
There's a lot of good ones out there, but just having meetings like this, you should be able to pick up a lot of things. And there's a Jewish Gen course that they put out, which is really pretty good. You can do individual one-on-one, or you can go in a group, and it's very reasonable. Nancy is in charge of that for Jewish Gen. So there's some great courses, and I urge you to get your children and grandchildren involved. I got a couple of nephews involved now, and they wanted all this information, and I'm really pleased about that, because let's face it, we're all getting older.
Yeah, Phil, I'd like to recommend a book to our friends here, A World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe.
Oh, yeah.
That is a classic. It talks about the Jewish immigrant experience.
Good. Excellent. Okay. Anyone else?
I just read a fiction book called The German Girl, and she winds up on the St. Louis and was turned back.
Yes.
And when I went to the Holocaust Museum in St. Pete, there's a bit, it shows the St. Louis and the captain who tried helping them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Someone at one of the IJGS meetings, I think, did a presentation on that. They did one on St. Louis. I do one on St. Louis. And there's also one called the Nazi Titanic, which was very cool.
Huh.
That was cool too.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Well, I thank you all very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was
come back and do it
wonderful.
again. Thank you so much.
You're terrific. May you win the lottery.
And if you come to Philly, if you come to the IJGS meeting in Philly, I'll be there. So come and meet me in person.
Okay.
Where in Philly?
It's going to be at the Sheraton, August. I can't remember the dates.
Okay.
It's the international meeting of the International Jewish Genealogical Society. It's a great meeting. It's a wonderful meeting. And if you really want to get into Jewish genealogy, that's the place to go.
Okay.
So
Thank you,
Thank you
Phil.
very much.
thank you all
Thank
very
you.
much for coming.
Bye-bye all.
Be
Bye-bye.
well, everyone. Thank
You
you,
too.
Hey,
Kim.
one last announcement in response to Dale had asked me where he could view today's presentation. I've since sent everyone a chat message with all our links. So to repeat my answer to Dale, today's program, including, by the way, one of Phil's earlier presentations, I think from last season, is available on our YouTube channel, as generally are all of the Zoom session meetings that we have. And that's at www.youtube.com/@JGSSWF. It's in your chat window, and as well as our website and our other online presence.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Stay safe, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good
Thank you,
try.
Jim. Thank you, Howard.
Thanks very